I should mention, we're online as well. There are a number of people who are not available, but they're here. So hello. Chinese Canadian Historical Society, BC, 21 years young. Been promoting Chinese Canadian history, research, documentation, seminars, field trips. More recently, the Chinese Canadian Historical Society was working in Kelowna, helping out with the societies there, the museum, the Chinese Canadian Services Society, and the archival history of the Chinese, and the history of the Chinese Canadian pioneers in the Okanagan. More recently, an AGM. And so there are many activities. I encourage you to please go online to look at the many programs and activities. There are also some book prizes and annual awards that will be given out by the Chinese Canadian Historical Society. So your input is very much welcome. Earlier this spring, I came down to a garden. I was invited because there was this major exhibit, All Are Equal Under the Sun, under heaven, in remembrance of the 100th anniversary of the passing of Dr. Sun Yat-Sen. I was really impressed. I thought I knew a lot about Sun Yat-Sen. I began to learn how much I don't really know. I had a chance to listen to Frank, other speakers, and looking at the exhibit. So this afternoon, I think you're going to be in for a real wonderful opportunity. Just before we begin to, before I introduce the moderator for the afternoon, there are cookies, water, tea, refreshments, okay? And don't forget the gift shop, okay? It's very important. So welcome to there. I'm going to introduce the moderator for the program, Vivi Wong. Vivi is a youth advocate. She's working in secondary schools, high schools, community. And her major objective is to empower and work with youth with an equity lens. I was commenting earlier, it was several years ago, she attended a Chinatown walkabout sponsored by the Chinese Canadian Historical Society. Bob Sung, John Atkin, and myself, the three amigos. So she attended, and by golly, she was interested in finding out more about Chinese Canadian history. Several years later, she's on the board of the Chinese Canadian Historical Society. We really appreciate all your contributions. She's also she's on the board of the Wong's Association as well. So I'm going to turn it over to Vivi. She'll introduce the speakers and the responders and look after the program. All right, thank you.
Thank you so much, Hayne. I'm going to use a voice because my voice is very quiet today, so bear with me, but thank you so much, Hayne. It is an honor to be here and asked to be a moderator. I was just talking to Frank. I'm like, I'm learning a lot of Dr. Sun Yat-sen's information today and prior. So today's Paul Lin commemorative lecture marks the 100th anniversary of Dr. Sun Yat-sen's passing and commemorate his 3 historical visits here in Vancouver in 1897, 1910, and also 1911. Dr. Sun Yat-sen, recognized as a founder president of China by both mainland China and Taiwan, was a revolutionary leader who received a strong support from the Chinese Canadian communities. This lecture explores the remarkable intersections between Confucius, China's greatest sage, Vancouver, a key support of his revolutionary cause, and Dr. Sun, a scholar whose intellectual political journey bridges both worlds. Now, I want to share a few words about Paul and Lin commemorative lecture and its history. In 2016, Paul and Eileen Lin Commemorative Fund was established to sponsor an annual Lin lecture on historical topics related to China-Canada relations or Chinese-Canadian history. The lecture is one of the many events that CCHS-BC produces to promote Chinese-Canadian history. Now, born in Vancouver, Paul Lin was a founder and director of the Center of East Asian Studies at McGill University, and where Lin also received her master's degrees in the Library of Science in 1969. In 1981, Paul was appointed to the rector of the University of Macau, and together they founded the Chong Lin Children's Foundation of Canada. Paul later became an honorable professor at UBC, and in 1998, received the Order of Canada. In 2004, Paul unfortunately passed away, and Eileen passed away recently last year. But both Paul and Eileen have devoted their lives to reestablishing diplomatic relations between Canada and China, enhancing international friendships and promoting social justice. Their legacy still lives strong as of today. Now, on to our main program of today's event. I want to introduce Frank, Dr. Frank Abbott, who will be making the presentation called Confucius to Vancouver, Thoughtful Travels with Dr. Yat-Sen. And after the presentation, there will be two respondents who will be sharing their words and reflections about the presentation, and an opportunity for me to moderate a bit of a discussions afterwards. And at the very end, we can open up the room for Q&A from the audience and also for those who's joining us online. Oh, hello. All right, so who is Frank? Frank is a historian taught Canadian Chinese European history of Kwantlen Polytechnic University from 1992 to 2015. Vice chair of the Board of Trustees of the Dr. Yat-Sen, Frank has been a Garden member since its opening in 1986, which is 39th year, as he mentioned. He coordinated, as Hayne mentioned, All Under Heaven Are Equal exhibit earlier this year. As you see, there are some of the panels that is shared here in this room. And his work has published extensively on Chinese Canadian history, including the recent work on Vancouver Chinatown and the gardens itself. Today, Frank will be exploring how Dr. Sun's life connected Confucian philosophy, revolution politics, and the Chinese Canadian community, which links that Western historians have largely overlooked despite its revolutionary status in China, Taiwan, and Chinese communities worldwide. Please welcome us. Frank, come on up. Thank you, the mic.
Let's do a little test. How's that? Okay. How is that? Is any better? As long as you microphone. Okay, great. Test. Anyone have a plane to catch? I'll keep it to the 30 minutes I've been allotted. So it's time for everybody to participate in that as well. Also, I'd like to welcome you on behalf of the garden. It's a pleasure having events like this here. This is a cultural institution on a couple of levels, on the purely garden aspect, but also as a wonderful example of traditional Chinese culture. China's given two important gifts to the world. The second one is traditional Chinese culture, but the first one by far is the Chinese people. So this is where it all comes together, I hope. It's a wonderful place to be. As mentioned, when you leave here today, there's a couple of exits, this one here, but also we've thoughtfully placed the exit through the gift shop for you. Justin. Okay, the welcome is over. Now let's, you may have wondered about this title. I hope it'll be clear by the time that I'm finished here and that as well. But it's basically, it came about because there's three things I wanted to find out. And I was quite surprised that I had to find these things out for myself. Like many other people in the West, I would have underestimated Dr. Sun Yat-sen's contribution to Chinese history. I mean, really. He inspired 10 revolts, all of which were not very successful. When the revolution happened by accident, he read about it in Denver and that as well. So in the West, there's this tendency to think, well, he's a nice guy, but you know, his ideas were a mishmash of Western ideas. And I used to think that as well until I went to his tomb in Nanjing. There we are. So in 2007, I finally got a chance to see where he is buried. And just quickly show you, you enter through this little entrance gate here. There's a bit of a walk to get to the other end from the bottom of the screen to the top. There's nearly 400 steps, as you can see, but it's consciously designed to mimic the imperial tombs nearby of the first few Ming emperors. You get close to one building. Traditionally, the Ming tombs are laid out this way, the Qing tombs as well. Above the entrance is this this piece of calligraphy, which we'll look at a little bit later. And then there is another little memorial hall with stories about his contributions to China. And then, as you see, we've come a long way in the past couple of seconds. Not too much further to go to the sacrificial hall. And above the doorways there are the three ancient style characters representing the three ideas that he brought to modern China. Nationalism, the people's welfare, and democracy. And we'll look at those a little bit as well. In the Memorial Hall, of course, there's a statue of Dr. Sun Yat-sen. And out back, the little round building is where his tomb is to this day. So it has not been moved since it was put there in 1929, a place of great reverence for a lot of people. And I have to say, after being there, knowing full well that it was a construction of the Nationalist Party to enshrine the myths of the Chinese Revolution, it is a very moving place, and deservedly so. So thoughtful travels with Dr. Sun Yat-sen. There's three things we look at: Dr. Sun and Confucianism. After I visited the tomb and I saw these inscriptions, I thought, none of the Western studies that I used to use in teaching Chinese history even mentioned them. And so I thought I would like to know his connection with Confucianism, which some of us think is a wonderful philosophy on its own, but how did he get hold of it? Dr. Sun Yat-sen in Vancouver. There's a lot of stuff written about his travels around the world. And it is mentioned that he came through Canada once or twice, but there's some very key events that happened in the course of in the development of the Chinese Revolution that happened here. And it seems nobody knows about them but us, and not many of us know them as well. So there's two things I wanted to find out. And then Sun Yat-sen, of course, in the Revolution of 1911. So this piece of calligraphy first, Jian Xiao Wei Gong. All under heaven are equal, literal translation, everything under heaven belongs to the people. There's a number of ways to translate this. Classical Chinese is like that. You can find lots of different ways to translate the same words. This comes from a much older document that is part of the Book of Rites, an ancient book that Confucius was one of the editors of. And can you all see the writing here? This is the most wonderful piece. I used to use it in teaching all the time, but had no idea that it had this influence on Dr. Sun Yat-sen. This is the ideal world. You can see the components of that ideal world. And here are the four characters, the phrase. It's used a lot. It's often always associated with Dr. Sun Yat-sen. President Xi Jinping is using it these days as well, which is an interesting sign of the influence of these words on the Chinese people. So basically says people should be taken care of in this ideal society. Confucius said these words in a moment of despair. He said, I'll never see this. I'll never see the great unity that this is about. I won't see it in my lifetime. Some people deduce from that this is utopianism, but a very important school of Confucianism in the early Han Dynasty, which went from 206 BC down to 220 AD. A guy born supposedly 195 BC, died 100 BC, basically said, this is not just something from the past. it gives us norms for the present and ideals for the future to reach. So the question is this utopianism, or is this the minimum you would expect from a reasonably just society? A society without care for all the people that are shown here. Would anyone want to live in it where people are not taken care of? Or if you lived in such a society, could you be convinced that you're free? So Da Tong, the great unity, this philosopher here, Dun Zhongshu, said, no, it is not just something from the mythical past. This is something to aim for. This is what caught Dr. Sun Yat-sen's eye. And this was the Confucian basis of what he wanted to propose for China, as we will see. This is late-breaking Dr. Sun Yat history. Not only Dr. Sun Yat-sen, but his main rival, Kang Youwei. Dr. Sun, as you know, was born in Guangdong province, Canton province. So was Kang Youwei. So interestingly, two of the important figures in the reform revolutionary movement of the early 20th century China were born in the same area of China. Kang Youwei came from a family of scholars, 7 generations of scholars. He wrote a breakthrough book in 1897, Confucius as a Reformer, had a great deal of influence on a lot of young Confucian scholars at the time, including Sun Yat-sen, who was not a Confucian scholar by any means. He grew up in Hawaii from the age of 10. People have asked, well, how did he get his Confucianism? We'll come to that as well. But Kang Youwei had a great deal of influence on people. And he and Sun Yat-sen, interestingly, both competed for the loyalty of Chinese overseas people, including, and very particularly for our interest, people in Vancouver and Victoria. So Confucianism is fairly simple. It doesn't depend on the fear of heaven or the hope of heaven or the fear of hell. Confucianism is not a religion, so your behavior must come from within. So he said, respect spiritual beings, but keep them at a distance. So this was a philosophy of ethics. It certainly appeals to any kind of atheist for sure, but it's basically you must perfect yourself, and there is no other pressure on you except what comes from you. So maybe that's a little bit idealistic as well. But Dr. Sun also said the ideas of nationalism, democracy, and the people's welfare also came from China's past. Nationalism, nationalist thought is a heritage bequeathed to us by our ancestors, not to be imported from the West. Similar, you can see the others as well. Democracy lies in the traditional Da Tong, the ideal society, and the people's welfare. Confucius once said, don't worry about poverty, but about unequal distribution, which appeals to Dr. Sun Yat-sen's socialist sense as well. So in the early 20th century, because of all the horrible things that happened to the Chinese nation in the 19th century in particular, a lot of people were ready to dismiss Chinese culture, dump it. The picture you see in front of the Tiananmen is May the 4th, 1919, came about because the Western powers gave parts of China to that Germany had occupied to Japan after the war, not to China. This unleashed among the students a burst of patriotism, which also led to questioning. This is where the old culture has led us. So in the early 20th century, some people said, dump it. Other people said, save it. And there were people who said, no, it can be blended. So there's a huge, wonderful debate. Sun Yat-sen, again, something you don't see in most of the English written literature. You don't see this this side of Sun Yat-sen. This is important. He was involved in the early debates, not just about politics, but about China's culture, China's future. So my investigations were very rewarding to me because of this, because you don't see this, as I mentioned, in a lot of the literature. And I'm not being critical of people, because until I went to China, saw his tomb, saw the respect that he's accorded, I might not have thought about these things either. Now, another thing that a lot of people outside of Canada don't really pay much attention to is the role of the Chinese diaspora community here and in Victoria. If you notice, this is a picture of Carroll Street. There's no date on it, but it must be after 1903, because this building right here across the street is still there. This was the headquarters of the Chinese Empire Reform Association that Kang Youwei set up. Kang Youwei, this groundbreaking scholar, wrote his book in 1897. The reigning emperor, the Guangxu emperor, brought him in to suggest ways of reform. In 1898, there was a brief 100-day period of reform, which would have led to China's modernization. This is the Vancouver that Sun Yat-sen would have first seen in 1898. A population in 1898, didn't write it down. Okay, not that big, but it grew very quickly thanks to the arrival of the CPR. The population of Chinatown, right there, in the 1890s was 1,000 people. In 1900, a little over 2,000. And by 1911, 3,560, the largest Chinese community in the country. This isn't the only reason Sun Yat-sen came to Vancouver. There was a very powerful business community here as well. The number of businesses between 1901 and 1911 went from 71 to 236. In 1901, the sales of the major merchants totaled $518,000, and they expended almost $800,000 in 1901. I didn't try and do the figures for what that would be today, but in 1901, the average working man's salary, if he worked every day of the working year, would have been around 500. So this is an amazing amount. The four largest firms made between $150,000 and $180,000 per year, or 6 times more than 2/3 of the other businesses. In addition, some of these wealthy Chinese people owned $2 million worth of real estate in Chinatown, and $1 million worth of real estate in other parts of Vancouver. Is anyone wondering why Dr. Sun Yat-sen would come to town looking for money? At the same time as the community was flourishing, of course, and there is Carroll Street looking west. That building on the corner is still there, Pender and Carroll. This is Pender Street looking east. This building is still there. It used to be the home of the Chinese Times. This building is definitely there. It's on the west side of Pender and north side of Pender, west side of Carroll. This was the home of the Chinese Freemasons, Chi Kung Tong, a fraternal association with a very strong anti-Manchu philosophy. It had dormitories for people. There was a school in there. On the top floor was Yu Cho's photography studio, where he took that wonderful picture of Dr. Sun Yat-sen over there. Dr. Sen walked these streets, and I thought it'd be good for us to see the kind of Chinatown he was in. And there are the two buildings I mentioned, the Chinese Times and the Chinese Freemasons. But not all was well. This is 1907, the September anti-Chinese riots. Lots of property damage. Imagine being these little kids and watching these goons coming through town, what an effect that would have on them. The Asiatic Exclusion League, not a glorious moment in Vancouver's history. But this was a resilient community. There are many ways to picture the Chinese community of Vancouver. Many of them are true, but there's often a tendency in the literature, somewhat changing now, to emphasize the racism, which is very quite valid, and then to say, well, there are victims, but this community was real resilient and responded in big and little ways. 10 years after the declaration that Vancouver was a city, 1896, this guy on the right, Li Hongchan, China's superstar statesman, came to town. He took the long way. He left China, went to Russia first, then to Germany, then to France, then to England, met Queen Victoria, hung out with the British elite, crossed the ocean, went to the States, then came to Toronto. He went to the Canadian National Exhibition, took the CPR back to Vancouver. I don't think he wanted to go through the States because since 1882, there was the Chinese Exclusion Act. So many Chinese dignitaries preferred to come through Canada on the CPR. He was here for a day. This is part of the crowd that came to welcome him. Vancouver had a population of, I think, 10,000 in 1896. 6,000 people came out to welcome him. I don't know if you can see the crowd, but it is a mixture of Asian faces and European faces as well. This was big news. If Queen Victoria can hang out with this guy, so can the mayor of Vancouver, sitting in the carriage with the guy named Abbott of the CPR. No relation, we're the poor Abbotts. This is a rich guy. This is a community that was sure enough of itself to raise triumphal arches to say, we are here. This is 1901, when another guy came to town. This is the future George V, King of England, came with future Queen Mary, spent 3 or 4 days here. This is an arch the Chinese community put up to welcome them in 1901 as well. This is a community that said, here we are. And the Chinese Merchants Association and the Chinese Empire Reform Association, which I'll tell you about in a sec, offered a joint address that said basically to this heir to the throne, that your Chinese subjects in Canada are just as loyal as anyone else, making the point, here we are. It didn't get reported in the local press, but in the book published by the government of Canada in cooperation with the prince and the princess, made sure this address was mentioned. And finally, in 1912, we'll have a picture in a moment, I think. Oops. Okay, there we go. At Pender and Carroll, this arch went up to the Governor General of Canada, who happened to be the uncle of George V. A welcome from the Chinese community. If you look on either side of Wan Ying welcome, you see this multicolored fan-like thing. That is the new flag of the Republic of China. So the influence of revolution had come within less than a year of the real revolution. But Sun Yat-sen didn't have everything his own way. The Chinese Empire Reform Association, founded by Kang Youwei, the groundbreaking scholar, was founded in Victoria in 1899 with help from the Chinese merchants of Victoria and Vancouver as well. Their logo, or you see it in all their documents, this is the emperor, this is Kang Youwei, this is Liang Qichao, his main lieutenant. This proposed as a remedy for China's problems, a constitutional monarchy. It's possible that in the visits of the royal people to Vancouver, particularly in 1901, when they made the Loyal Address, was a moment of political education for CERA members on what a functioning constitutional monarchy looked like, not just for the CERA members, but for the merchants of Vancouver. So I don't know, are any of you merchants in here? Oftentimes it said merchants like predictability. They prefer gradual change rather than revolutionary upsurges. And so for a long time, the CERA in Vancouver had far more support among the Chinese merchants, Chinese people of Vancouver than did Sun Yat-sen. This is their building. It's across the street. It's now a clan building because after 1909, the CERA gradually declined for reasons which I'll get to in a sec. This is their building in Victoria, which is still marked as such. It's still there today as well. This is free BC history stuff for people. This is an early meeting of the Vancouver Chamber. This is Alexander Commemorative. He was the first Chinese Canadian kid born here in Vancouver. In 1947, he was the first Chinese Canadian to vote when long overdue enfranchisement came. I don't know this gentleman. This is Yip-Yen. This is Yip-Sang, a very powerful family in the Chinese community. The building across the street where the Chinese Canadian History Museum was their place. Very powerful family of merchants. And this guy is Liang Qichao, the lieutenant of Kang Youwei. This is the executive of the Chinese Empire Reform Association in Vancouver. And here is another picture of many of the same people. You see the Yips there. There's Alexander Commemorative, Yip-Sang as well. So very much involved in reform rather than revolution. Here is the the Chinese Empire Reform Association of Canada, 53 lodges, 6,000 members. This was a worldwide organization. It was founded here. And when people started in CERA losing faith in the ability of the Chinese Empire to reform itself, the troubles started here, partly because of the failure of the Qing dynasty reforms. And partly it has to be said because the business interests and the personal interests of Kang Youwei and his circle and the Yips diverged. So CERA was not just a political organization, it depended on personal contacts, personal suitability, and stuff like that as well. The other thing about the CERA is that it had a women's division. This was founded in BC, the first women's political organization in Chinese history. Think of what you learn. I mean, it struck me. This is not in the main literature about the Chinese Revolution or even of Sira. So there's some big things happening in this community. And then finally, do autocracies undermine themselves? The last part of my little talk. Do autocracies commit suicide unintentionally? This is from 1898. There's a newspaper in France, Le Petit Journal. I like their graphics a lot because they're not always totally accurate, but they're very colorful and dramatic. You may recognize some of the people in this picture. I didn't know that Queen Victoria liked pizza, for one thing. Now I know. But these are the people carving up China in 1898. This was a situation in China. These are areas of foreign domination. And the question is, what was the Qing dynasty doing to deal with these problems? Not just those problems, but internal problems as well. Foreign spheres of influence, military defeats. In 1860, a British-French army of occupation was in Beijing for a while, forcing the emperor to make peace. So a lot of military defeats. In 1895, the Japanese defeated the Chinese Navy. But in addition to that, there was the North China famine from 1876 to 1879. Between 9.5 and 13 million people died. This one time, this went on in the 1920s, wasn't just the Qing dynasty. In 1896, 97, 98, another famine in North China. In 97, 98, in Shandong province, another famine. This is, inspired the Boxer Uprising. 1900, a drought in North China. And in 1907, 1911, famines as well. So it didn't look like the Qing dynasty was able to deal with those things. But in 1898, this young man, the new emperor, the Guangxu emperor, thought it's time for reform. The humiliating defeat by the Japanese encouraged him and his advisor, Kang Yue, to issue a whole bunch of edicts, probably too much too soon. Lasted 100 days. And then mother stepped in. His adoptive mother. This is the Dowager Empress Cixi. I used to love teaching about her. She is the most wonderful villain. But the question is, she did the same things that a man ruling in the same spot would do, but somehow with her, it was worse. It seems like there's a little bit of hint of sexism in this as well. You do what you got to do if you're in power. She said no, and she'd been in power for 40 years. There might have been emperors, but she ran it. She was the terrible mother-in-law, I suppose, if you like. So for 40 years, it was rather unfortunate that she ran things. Rather unfortunate for China, rather unfortunate for this guy as well. She supported the Boxer Uprising in 1900. The picture on the left is again from a French newspaper showing the slaughter of missionaries. It's very highly propagandized. These are not accurate depictions. This is what the editors saw or wanted people to see. The other photograph is one of the few known pictures of the Boxers. This is these are the warships that came from the various foreign nations. Thousands of foreign troops. I didn't count the ships, but that's a lot. So no surprise, they occupied and plundered Beijing. And mother now was asked the question, and she said, yes, it's probably time to reform. Here she is, making nice with the wife of the American ambassador and other ladies from the West. It's hard to know whether her conversion was genuine or if it was just for the pictures. But the other unfortunate thing about her, not only that she lived, but then she died at the wrong time. Because in 1905, she sent imperial officials abroad to look at constitutional systems in other countries as hopefully a blueprint for giving China some reforms. She ordered then the creation of a consultative assembly. Then she and the emperor died. He rather suspiciously, she was on her way out anyway, everyone knew that. The day before she died, he suddenly died. It turns out cyanide helped the process. He was murdered. We don't know who or how or when, but I think in the early 2000s, there was an autopsy done and they said, yeah, it was cyanide. But then people said, well, you know, maybe it was in the drinking water or something. Maybe it was. But anyway, he was killed. There are some pictures of his funeral. She had a bigger funeral. She had a bigger tomb. So who's in charge? So the new emperor was this little guy, Puyi, and his mother, who was the new dowager empress. So both of them, well, obviously the kid, but also the empress, politically very inexperienced. So it depended on the Manchu nobles who were the regency council to decide the future. So nonetheless, reform proposals proceeded. So the promised assembly opened, 98 delegates chosen by the court, 98 representing regional interests. So there's no question that it's going to be equal. Also, there was to be a responsible cabinet, April 1911. 4 Han Chinese, representing 98% of the population, 1 Mongol, 8 Manchu princes, and the advisory assembly only, not any with real power. And these guys represented 2% of the population. When Sun Yat-sen heard about these reform proposals, he said they're just bringing on trouble for themselves. So the assembly never happened. The building, they had the foundations for a while, but the building was never built. A German architect designed the building. It looked very much like the Reichstag in Berlin. The political system looked very much like the Reichstag in Berlin. No power, just consultative. So we come to 1911. This was China's first national flag. Didn't last very long. 10th of October, 1911. Where the flashpoint is in Hankou, a bunch of revolutionary conspirators were caught building bombs. They thought, we better keep on going because if we stop and surrender, it's going to be death. They kept on going. The local officials fled, the army took over, and within weeks, the whole country, you could see all the, maybe you can't see them on this, but there's lots of little explosions. This was the 1911 revolution. Dr. Sun was in Denver. The top flag is the banner they carried. The bottom one is the new flag of the empire, or of the republic, representing the ethnic divisions in the country. Here are some very dramatic, probably not very accurate accounts of the capture of Nanjing, the southern capital, done by a Japanese artist in the 1920s. There are photographs, they're not very interesting. These are fantastic. Gives you a sense, maybe not of the actual events, but of the drama. And one of the first things, the pigtail was cut off. In the 1680s, I think the law came down. All Chinese men had to grow their hair in pigtails as a sign of loyalty to the new Qing dynasty, which came into power in 1644. So a sign of your rebellion before 1911, you notice how Sun Yat-sen is dressed, the Vancouver merchants as well before 1911. They've made their choice. This is the first Republican assembly in Shanghai, later on moved to Nanjing after it had been captured. This is from the Vancouver World of late in 1911, the dawn of a new era. So the Vancouver papers were keeping up with these events. Here is Sun Yat-sen, made president of the Republic. This is February 15th, 1911. He went to the Ming tombs outside Nanjing to the first emperor, Hongwu, and said to him, we have reversed the shameful occupation of the 268-year Manchu rule. He reported to them, I think in deference to his connections with the Chinese Freemasons, the Chonghe Tong, whose operative assumption was get rid of the Manchus, restore the Ming. So here is Sun Yat-sen making his report 3 days after the Manchus abdicated and said, we step down, heaven obviously wants us to. And curiously then they said, we order the formation of a republic. I have never heard an imperial dynasty do anything like that, call her a republic. Sun Yat-sen went on for several years and became president for a month. Yuan Shikai, the military man who betrayed the Guangxu Emperor in 1898, betrayed the Qing dynasty in 1911, and then betrayed the Republic in 1913, became the president instead. He didn't last long. He died, apparently had a heart attack in his outhouse. And China was split up among his various generals. Sun Yat-sen basically had control of Guangdong province and hoped by the time of his death that China would be reunited. It was by 1928. And so when he died, this is a picture of the memorial march in Vancouver to him. And the esteem to which he was held. So the CERA declined. Sun Yat-sen just kept on pushing, looking for support. The Qing dynasty discredited itself in the eyes of people here. And basically, my conclusion is that Sun Yat-sen was certainly important for the history of modern China. There's no doubt about that. But I think we here can say he was very important for the history of Chinese Canadians as well. He gave Chinese Canadians a sense of themselves. They had started it on their own. He's not the only person, but within that community came the strength to pursue their rights. And long overdue in 1947. A few days ago, there was a memorial service at the Chinese Canadian Cenotaph over there. A lot of the veterans said thanks to their service, but it was already there in the making that allowed these veterans to sign up and say, we want our rights as well. So this was important for Chinese Canadians as much as for China. And I think this is the best monument. This is a nice monument, but the things he empowered the Chinese Canadians to do is probably the best monument of all. So I hope I didn't go over. I wasn't watching. If anyone had a plane to catch again, so sorry. But thank you very much.
You can have a seat anywhere else. Okay. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Frank Abbott. I truly learned a lot as someone who grew up here in Vancouver myself. Nothing in the textbooks that I have at school. The only time that I actually really heard about this person was, the name of this garden, Dr. Sun Yat-sen garden here in Chinatown. So thank you so much for the in-depth presentation. I actually recently learned as well, Dr. Sun Yat-sen also visit one of the ancestral town that my great-grandfather lived in Ashcroft. So he did travel around, not just only Vancouver. It seems like he also traveled in the different areas of BC as well, fundraising and campaigning as well. All right, so our next speaker, or actually I should say our first respondent, is Jeffrey Wong. Jeffrey Wong is the Vice President of the Wong's Pavilion Association and is the recipient of the 2022 CCHSBC Dr. Wallace and Madeline H. Chung Prize for the Chinese Canadian Community Archiving. A Vancouver-born historical preservationist, Jeffrey has researched Dr. Sun's visit to Vancouver and his revolutionary campaign. So Jeffrey is a pleasure to have you up here and talk a little bit about, his connection here in Vancouver, Chinatown. So come on up.
Yeah, thank you, Frank, for giving me such a great talk on Dr. Sun, and thank you, CCHS, for inviting me to talk on Dr. Sun's here in Vancouver, and then perhaps his connections to some of the clan organizations. My name is Jeffrey Wong. I'm from the Wong's Benevolent Association, as my fellow cousin Vivi has introduced me. With Dr. Sun, a lot of the information on him, especially in the clan associations, are very sparse because most of the associations weren't founded until 1911. There were a few before 1911, such as the Chinese Freemasons, that helped fundraise for his campaign in the revolution. But all those documents have actually either sadly been lost or damaged, or even still locked up in one of the clan association buildings, such like the Wongs. We have very sparse information on him at the Wongs Association. So hopefully I can shed some light on maybe some of the information that I've learned about Dr. Sanson and his campaign in Vancouver, and also what actually transpired after he left, after the revolution. Because some of the stuff that we know, although there's not a lot of archival material left about him, is oral histories, gossip, essentially gossip. My elders have told stories of what his elders used to tell him about what they saw. So like this gentleman here, or Wong Fun-sin, the unofficial mayor of Chinatown. This gentleman is called Wong Jim-gun. Both of them were founders of the Wong's Association. The original one was Wong Wen-san Society, and the one afterwards in 1923 was the Wong Gong Ha Tong. They're influential and essential in founding the Wong's Association, but both of them have stated that they heard Dr. Sanson speak when he was in Vancouver. Wong Fun-sin was in Cumberland, and he was in Victoria. Wong Jim-gun was in Victoria. So a lot of them were inspired by what he said while he was in Vancouver, and that China needs to modernize. We need to stand up so that so that the Western countries don't bully us anymore. And what he said was so influential that a few years later, in 1913, the Wong Wen-sun Society, founded by the Wongs, were rallied together, created an association. Then in 1923, built the building, following actually what Dr. Sanson had promoted, modernity, power, strength. There are a lot of notes in our constitution that says absolutely no opium smoking in our buildings, no gambling. And this was objectively to promote modernity in the West. And because when Dr. Sanson came, after Dr. Sanson came, don't forget that in 1907, the riots came through, and the Chinese community felt hopeless. They didn't know what to do, and the Qing wasn't really actively protecting our neighborhood. So people like Jim Goon and Fun-sin pushed strongly for these associations to form and actually help Dr. Sanson. So there are little bits and pieces of what happened after Dr. Sanson came to Vancouver. So this is one of our meeting minutes that we recently found, actually this year while we're doing our archival work, from 1909. And it's a meeting minute that was summoned, an emergency meeting minute summoned by the Wong's Association regarding a Wong Junhang, which was the founder of the Tongmen Way in San Francisco, that helped campaign for Science Revolution. And he came to Vancouver to found a Tongmen Way here in Victoria and in Vancouver. And this is a testament to say that not everyone liked what Dr. Sanson was doing, because Wong Junhang was actually beat up. And the Wong's Association had an emergency meeting to actually figure out what to do and should we retaliate and go against the Empire Reform Club. What happened afterwards, we don't know, because then after this, the meeting minutes went silent until 1913. Yes, so whether or not there was a blood battle on the street, which happened quite often at that time, we don't know, but they did discuss it. And yeah, after the revolution in 1911, the Wong's Association officially founded in 1913. And so this is one of our buildings that the Wongs founded. This is a later photo. But again, following the teachings of Dr. Sanson, it was very modern at that time. It wasn't Chinese. It wasn't. They found the most expensive. It was the most expensive thing they could buy. Most very modern. They had electricity. They had indoor plumbing. There wasn't any other than the altar to the ancestor, the Wong's ancestors. There's not your typical stereotypical Chinese carvings on the walls, or the chairs are very Western, and it was a way to project modernity in Canada to the West. And as you can see, there's a little photo right here of Dr. Sanson. And so even after he passed away, this was in I think this photo is 1939. They still revered him very much. not this one, sorry. The slides are back in order. And so it's another photo of Dr. Sanson. This is not in Vancouver though. This is in Victoria at the Fook Sin Tong. A lot of the community actually revered him very much. So much so that most of the associations had a photo of Dr. Sanson on their walls. I'm gonna go back. And so, yeah, afterwards, when he did die, this is another photo we found, a photo album of his passing at the memorial that the community held for him in the neighborhood. This is the procession that was in Frank's slide, but there was a large album that they published after his death of all the Guomindang associations that are in Canada and all their activities to kind of commemorate Dr. Sun Yat-sen and his work in Canada. And this is the funeral that they held for him, the memorial they held for him in the hall of the Guomindang. There is Jim Grew right there. It's a little bit blurry, but he's in the front row. Foon Scene is right here. So all these influential Wongs, or the Wongs and actually community members, there's a Chan Shuyun is right here. They later became leaders of the community and continue to follow in the footsteps of Dr. Sun Yat-sen and went through his teachings, created schools, created associations like Hansing Athletic Club that kind of projected a more healthier way to be Chinese and not just follow in the stereotypes of the West and be opium smokers or gambling addicts. So yeah, this is more photos of the funeral procession. Yeah, and so that's basically it from what we could find on in the associations, because there's not a lot that survived on Dr. Sun Yat-sen, but that doesn't mean it's still not out there. We are still continuing to dig through our archives. Just yesterday, as in preparation for today, we were digging through and we found the 100th birthday commemoration poster that they published, the Wongs did. It's on the corkboard over there. And it was just a list of things that the community published of what he used to do from the day he was born up until his death. And it was and on the back, it's actually what the community, on the back of the poster, there was a celebration that the community held for him. So we're still continually finding things in the association as we're digging through our archives. Hopefully we'll find out more. But yeah, that's it. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Jeffrey. It's always great to have like that lens of like prevalence of, you know, in our community, how much it really influenced some of the work that he has done and the connection that we have had in this Chinese Canadian community here in Vancouver. Now we have our final respondent, Dr. Henry Yu. Dr. Henry Yu is a professor of the history at the University of British Columbia, specializing in migration, ethnicity, and urban history in the Pacific Rim region. Professor Yu's research focused on Asian Canadian and Asian American history, as well as the transnational connections. Welcome, Henry.
Thank you. Thanks so much. And it's a real honor to be here. And thanks, Dr. Abbott, for that wonderful, informative, and I think, again, shining light on something that a lot of people don't know about the history of both Sun Yat-sen in China, as well as in the overseas Chinese networks and communities. So I also really appreciated Jeffrey sort of sharing some of the absence, actually, of Sun Yat-sen. So I'm going to make kind of three rough points just as a way to kind of further some of those themes. But I'll start with myself. My family on my mother's side was born in Zhongshan County. So unlike the majority of overseas Chinese, we come from the 8 counties that's very marginal in North America. So the 4 counties, Toisan, Huiping, those are the dominant overseas Chinese. Liang Jiqiao and Gang Youwei were both from Huiping, right? And in fact, there was an imperial academy in the 4 counties that would send, these scholar officials from peasant villages. When you were born and you were really smart in rural China during the imperial dynasties, the whole village would collect money together to send you to be taught. Let's say you started talking when you were like 15 months or something, and you just showed, you were really, really clever. You would be invested in by the village. You would be sent. And fortunately, because there had been a high-ranking prime minister from the four counties, about 1,000 years ago, he was able to actually put an imperial academy in the four counties. And that's why the four counties was very successful at sending people into the imperial bureaucracy, scholar officials that ran China. That civil service became the inspiration for Britain and Germany to adopt the civil servant system of examinations that we still use to this day. Why am I going into this detail? Because my family was incredibly chauvinistic about having come from Zhongshan. And you're like, do you know what our county is named after? Sun Yat-Sen, so, the father of modern China. So there was such a level of pride because, Zhongshan had been renamed Zhongshan. It used to be Hengshan, the same Heng as Heonggong, like the fragrant harbor. So fragrant county. We had very nice smells in Zhongshan County. But it was renamed in the 1920s for our greatest son, right? And from then on, that chauvinism ran out. Now, Zhongshan people dominated in the overseas Chinese in several places. One was Hawaii. The majority of Chinese in Hawaii are from Zhongshan. Another was Australia. The majority of Chinese in Australia are from Zhongshan. Very few from Siyap or Samyap from 4 counties or 3 counties, the other of the 8. Right? Other places we dominated were like certain pockets in Southeast Asia. We had a lot of merchants in Penang and in Malacca because Zhongshan people had been coming out through Macau into the Portuguese-dominated ports of Southeast Asia for centuries, long before people started to leave Siap. Or it wasn't until the 19th century that large numbers of people started going from the 4 counties and the 3 counties, whereas people from Zhongshan had been going out into Southeast Asia for almost a millennium. And before them, people from Hokkien, from Fujian, had been going out into Southeast Asia for 1,500 years. And before them, people who were Chaozhou or Teochew people had dominated the rice trade of all Southeast Asia for over 2,000 years. That's why to this day, if you go to Bangkok or to, Vietnam or Indochina, anyone in the rice industry that dominates international rice trades, they're all from descended from the same people who are Teochew, right, or Chaozhou people, because that was the first outport for people to leave into Southeast Asia. So why am I going into this history? Because that chauvinism is that we also understand Sun Zhongshan or Sun Yat-Sen as a human within these broader networks of people leaving rural villages. 99% of Chinese were rural villagers for most of its history. Right? The few that climbed up were either you were that smart kid as a 12-month-old, 13-month-old start talking, you could become a scholar official. You'd be educated. You could read and write. You would also be taught how to speak the Mandarin language. Mandarin is the Portuguese word for scholar official, because the first time they heard it, they kind of went, weird. That's not Chinese, because what they knew of Chinese was what the overseas Chinese in Malacca spoke. They created a Chinese Portuguese dictionary. And then they heard these people who were scholar officials speaking, and it was a Beijing dialect or a court dialect. They had no idea what they were saying. So they called that language Mandarin. And we use that still to this day for that language, which is the northern dominant dialects. Southern Chinese spoke, literally Tonghua, the language of the Tang dynasty. And the home China was Tongshan, the mountain from which the people of the Tang came. We were chauvinists about Tang poetry. You can read we knew every Tang poem because that was the height of Chinese civilization with the Tang dynasty. The chauvinism of people who were overseas was that they were the inheritors of Chinese civilization. They were going to bring back from the Manchu, from the the barbarians of the north. When I was young, my father's from the north. Not really. He grew up sort of in Nanjing and in other parts of China. But when my grandfather, who was from Zhongshan, from the county that dominated migration to Hawaii, when first time he met my father, he just said, he called him a barbarian, a bakfongyan, a northerner. For the rest of his life, he refers, whenever talking to my mother about my father, as tell the bakfongyan, tell the barbarian from the north to do this, to do that, to do that, because this was a Cantonese dominated overseas China. My dad spoke Mandarin. He had to learn to speak to my grandmother in Zhongshan dialect. I'm kind of go into this because those networks that were the revolutionary networks, that were the nationalist networks, they actually were based on these incredibly chauvinistic networks of people coming from the same counties who couldn't understand each other if they spoke their home dialects. So there are stories of Sun Yat-sen speaking in Southeast Asia, and he had to have a translator who would actually translate it into Siyap, into the Toisan and Hoiping dialects, because otherwise no one would understand what he was saying. Sometimes he would speak in English because he learned English in Hawaii at the Punahou school, the same school that, famous people like the Obama would go. Punahou was the elite school. He learned English there. He became a Christian. But the peasants wouldn't have really understood him. One of the great things about Sun Yat-sen or Sun Zhongshan is even his name, Zhongshan was actually not given to him by his fellow Chinese. It was after he was exiled to Japan that it was the Miyazaki, Toten Miyazaki, same as Miyazaki, like the Ghibli studio, Ghibli. Miyazaki, he was a revolutionary. He was supporting revolutionary movements all around Asia. There were people who were anti-British. They were being held, they were exiled and they were being hidden in Japan. There was thousands of Chinese students in Japan learning about modernity. They were learning terms like democracy, and the way that it's written in Chinese, it came through Japan because it was the Japanese Meiji Restoration that actually was the heart of modernity in Asia. And you went to Japan to learn this if you were a Chinese student. And the Tongwenhui was organized in Japan and supported financially by Japanese who were supporting Asian nationalists in India, in Vietnam, in China. The name Zhongshan was from Nakayama. It was actually a reverse translation from Nakayama, which is the Japanese for Middle Mountain. And that came from a French revolutionary idea, the Middle Mountain was the revolution would be built around you. I had heard from those who, in my family, who kind of dismissed Sun Yat-sen, was that it was also used mockingly during his life. There was people, because he was all talk. And I'll end here. Sun Yat-sen, during his life, could talk. And that was the reputation. He was a talker. But he had no power. He had no army. And he kept on taking money for these ideas. And he was, accused of being a bit of a con man. That, the Tongwenhui, there was a number of people in the Tongwenhui who accused him of actually fraud, that he kept on raising money and raising money. Now, I say this because one of the greatest things he did for, you could say, modern China was to die. Because in his death, he could become all things to all people. So that's why the Communist Party reveres him. That's why the KMT reveres him. That's why everyone who lives in Zhongshan generations to come could revere him, because his frailties as a human, he was a great talker. He had lots of ideas, but he had no army. He kept failing, actually. These uprisings kept getting a lot of people killed. If you joined him, it was very likely you weren't going to survive. Because in some sense, he wasn't that great of an actual revolutionary, but he had ideas that people believed in, and they would adopt after and during the 1920s in his death. You know, everybody could go back and say he embodied all the ideals we believe in. Even if you were political enemies, you could still hold him as the father of the nation that you were trying to build. And so that's a kind of way to kind of also talk about why he was so supported overseas, is because people saw the humiliation of China by Japan in that war, right? And so they wanted to support a stronger China. After the 1907 riots, you saw that Japan, the Japanese government, could support Japanese Canadians here, but that was too weak to really do much for Chinese here. And so that idea of the weak or sick man of Asia and the need for a stronger China, Sun Yat-sen could embody that eventually, but really only in his death. He was made the provisional president basically because he had no army, and all the people with armies could agree that he could serve as the figurehead provisional government leader. But really, he didn't have that military power that you need to actually become the next real leader. So anyways, hopefully that's a helpful way to also understand that human behind these trips, and why it was during his own lifetime, even though he could be inspiring, he really wouldn't make a great president because he didn't have the backing politically to actually serve as the first president of China in an effective way. Anyways, look forward to discussions.
Thank you so much, Henry. That's a really great perspective to actually add on to this talk for today. Maybe I can quickly invite Frank, Jeffrey, Henry to have a quick seat at the red special chair for today. We have only a few minutes left for our event, but I do really want to open up the stage for some questions from our audience, and also from those who are joining us online as well. I know I was looking at some of those questions that might be coming up. Well, thanks again for a really in-depth presentation, reflections on Dr. Sun Yat-sen. Okay. I just wanted to maybe open up to the floor. Does anybody have any questions on what you have learned today, or any question to us particular speakers? You're welcome to. Okay, do you?
Yeah, so say that. The other thing is that the two connections that Paul started saying where his granddaughter, Lily's son, came here. Dr. Lin, I think it was 2001 or 2002. In one of your books. I had looked at the moment. I was just looking through the preparations for these. And she has photographs in there for personal collection that has taken in Vancouver. So I'm going to send that book. Okay, so I have at the phone, so I can get hold of one of you. And just pictures of people. It's from nothing home. I think that's Freemasons. So the pictures also in Victoria and places just like Canada. So I don't know where. Yeah, that was one thing. And the other thing is seeing Tingling. Yes, she struck an article, right? And I was a witness to history where she was writing anyway, so to say that after Dr. Sayers said that family members did come back to the convention. So it's pretty nice.
And then for those, I don't know if we mentioned at the beginning, but Paul and Eileen Chin, Eileen Lin, his wife, actually went to school with Song Jingling there's a very famous frontier girls' school in Shanghai. They were actually classmates in the year. So that's why she actually created the Song Jingling Foundation. The Song Jingling was very much about charity towards children. So Song Jingling married Sun Yat-sen, and then they were together for about a decade, and then he died, and then she went on to basically receive that martyrdom that he got. And so she was heroic both for the Communist Party and the KMT, whereas her sister, Chiang Kai-shek, was pretty reviled by many Chinese, including some sort of Communist Party. So it's interesting that those two sisters, you can see that difference in their trajectory. One became revered as the wife of Sun Yat-sen, the other not so much so.
Great. Thank you for that information. Anybody else have any questions? Yes, Hayne, at the back.
Um, 1905, there was a newspaper war between Sun Yat-sen and Kang CBRA. But also I just discovered they both tried to have each other assassinated. So Marie-Claire Berger pointed out that both of them have really big egos. So maybe that had something to do with it. But I was rather surprised that both of them took that. It didn't happen. But they really contemplated. Just saw the movie The Hitman, so maybe there's some kind of something going on there.
And a lot of people wanted both dead.
Yeah.
I mean, they wanted each other dead, but the Qing wanted Gang Wei dead. After the reforms failed, he had to flee to San Francisco and grew here. Actually, he came into Canada. We have his records in the head tax registry when he comes in, because he couldn't get to the United States directly. So he actually smuggled into the US after that, into Canada. But yeah, many people wanted both dead, including each other. That's why they both had lots of bodyguards. Yeah, a lot of martial artists protecting each of them.
Yes, I remember Franklin paper, you did mention bodyguards on. So it's a very serious business. I just want to check in with Isa. Is there any questions from the online Zoom? Okay, thank you so much. Oh, we can squeeze in maybe just one more.
That he never really acknowledged that the largest contributions came from, like, he never acknowledged City and Chinese and the Netherlands, especially from all of the
Yeah.
I was gonna say, God, probably something.
Well,
You'd be awesome.
if you're investing in a revolution, you have to take your chances, right?
Right.
I read that somewhere that in the Chinese Freemasons, they had a nickname for something that Henry said as well, they didn't pay back, but I don't know, he had a lot of debt, so where do you begin to pay back? And so it was, I mean, he did raise a lot of money, a lot more here. I read somewhere that he raised 40% of the money for the Canton uprising in 1911 from Canada.
Yes.
The largest amount from anywhere. So this was a powerful community. Interestingly, I had somebody look through the Chinese Times for the funeral, the memorial march. He said, I found no mention of this in the Chinese Times, but I found it in the Vancouver press. So, what is that? It says something, right? Maybe they forgot there was a memorial. They wanted people to forget, or it was their day off or something. No, they didn't mention it. So there's something there, but I don't know how long it lasts. We're thinking the Freemasons mortgaged their building, so then I think that Victoria, and they had to remortgage it. I read in 1925 there was a remortgaging.
Go ahead, Kurt. I want to hear the gossip. I want to hear the gossip.
what I've heard from my elders is that a lot of the major supporters was the Chinese Freemasons at that time. And Chinese Freemasons owned and operated a lot of businesses that were kind of on the darker side, gambling dens and the other places. So when Dr. Sanderson actually, when the revolution succeeded and he can either form a country and a government, he couldn't really acknowledge that the Freemason helped because he constantly wanted to separate himself. He wanted to make China modern, and he did not want to tie himself to an image that actually it was the people that ran these places that put him in. So a lot of them, so he actually had to stay very quiet. And after that, a lot of them did feel let down and they opposed him. And so when the Guomindang Dawn was actually trying to be formed in Vancouver, the Freemasons actively tried to stop here in Vancouver. It required a lot of community effort to kind of form the Guomindang Dawn here in Vancouver. Yeah, and it lasted until the 50s and the 60s before a newer generation took over these places. The newer violence, not in the community that took over, that kind of changed this mentality that Sanderson betrayed us.
That sounds not just gossip. That's actually probably pretty close to. There's a couple of the three things that kind of not to really answer, but one was that actually money from Canada and the United States went much farther than from the rest of the diaspora. So even though there's lots of rich merchants in Southeast Asia, a laundryman could contribute money, and because of the exchange rate, you could build a school. So the first the first high school, Taishan Middle School #1, it was funded almost all from Canada, from waiters, laundrymen. It wasn't rich people in that sense. It wasn't just Yat-Sen donated a huge lecture hall, but a lot of the money just came from laborers because they could give a little, but went a long way in China. Whereas actually Southeast Asia, the money made in Southeast Asia didn't go as far in Southern China. So there's an exchange rate. And the same reason why you drive across the US that we used to buy eggs and gas, because the exchange rates are different. There's another reason, which is because he was from Busan and he was also an ancestry, and he couldn't speak Siap or Samyang or whatever. A lot of the institutions here, he wasn't considered much of a leader on them. In Hawaii, his brother was, that's why he became these places. So he himself kind of grown up with some means. So when he was growing up, went to the best schools, he got Christian education, he learned English, he learned all these fancy abstract ideas like modernity, all that kind of stuff. That made him strange. Like he wasn't a laundryman, he wasn't a waiter, he wasn't the type of people who actually made up these organizations. Again, the overseas Chinese were not highly educated. Yat-Sen began as an impoverished person. The merchant class wasn't the class in the sense that we think of creating themselves, their children that are in Southeast Asia. Richest families, they would have marriage alliances because they had merchant houses. They've been there for hundreds and hundreds of years. Overseas Chinese, you started with nothing, opened a business, made enough money. And so there was always that kind of scrambling. And to them, I think it's pretty clear in the gospel and stuff, he was very easily dismissed as a bit of a con man. It's really afterwards, as I said, in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, that in his absence as a human, then all these ideas that he was espousing were great ideas. He learned them in school in Hong Kong. It was really the organizing and touching to these, but it was Hong Kong learning. That's where most his reputation had as a talker, and being able to instill the students these ideas, modernity, democracy. But he could never deliver. I think I would agree with Frank on that. It's like it seemed like you're never able to deliver this revolution because he didn't have the armies. The money wasn't going for example. It was actually the triumphs. So that was the muscle. So you couldn't actually say when the leader of the secret societies because he wasn't their leader either. So
why all that money was raised?
was a lot of, and a lot of.
Illness.
Yeah, people didn't know what he spent the money on. I think that's the best way to put it.
It sounds like we might need a part two presentation, but I do want to really sincerely thank you, Frank, and for your presentation and response for your insightful words. And of course, all of you joining us today, this afternoon online as well. On behalf of the CCHSBC, thanks again for having this event. And thank you for the garden for hosting us such a memorable and 100th anniversary. This is a very special place to be for this event. So thanks so much for the garden as well. Please keep your ears and eyes open on the CCHSBC website. We do have some upcoming events for next year as well. But yeah, thanks for joining us and travel safe. And thanks again for everybody who's been part of this event. Thank you.